Thank you so much, Sharon and Ken, for that warm introduction. Dean and I are so excited to be presenting for all of you today from New York City. When John Mahalio approached us for presenting to the Federation of Credit on e-commerce fraud prevention, of course, we jumped at the offer. John has been such a great partner and advocate for us in the Movado Group, and we felt this was the least we could do for him. But as Dean and I were putting together today's webinar, we wanted to make sure that all of you left with something you can implement both in your professional and personal lives today. So we broke this presentation into 5 high-level parts with funny stories and tips along the way. So let's go ahead and take a look at today's agenda. So the agenda today will begin with the background of e-commerce fraud, and here we'll cover the who, what, where, why, when, and how of e-commerce fraud. We'll also look at the types of e-commerce fraud. So we'll take a look at the 3 main types, such as checkout, account takeover, and friendly fraud. We'll then cover the true cost of e-commerce fraud, from managing fraud itself to the impact of false declines and what they have on your customers. Then we'll look at the fraud options that are available to you, both internal and external options for managing fraud in your business. And finally, we'll open it up to Q&A. So before we get started into the meat of the presentation, my colleague Dean will get everyone up to speed with some important industry terms.
Hey, thanks so much, Anthony, and everyone for joining. Before we get too deep into the background of e-commerce fraud, we just wanted to highlight some important what we think are industry terms, and we'll be learning most of these concepts in more detail during the webinar. So we're not going to go over all of them right now. However, we would like to call out 6 important ones before we get started. So when we talk about e-commerce fraud, it's in basically for card not present or CNP transactions, which are transactions in where the merchant is unable to physically examine the credit card. So usually when a purchase is conducted via like a digital channel or over the phone, and unlike card present transactions where the cardholder is physically present, in CNP transactions, the merchant is liable for any costs that occur during a chargeback. So that includes the refund of the purchase price, shipping costs, and other fees. We also have highlighted personally identifiable information, which just refers to any information which could potentially be used to identify an individual. So things like full name, passport number, and so on. Companies holding this PII or personally identifiable information on their servers have to comply with oftentimes government mandated security regulations just to safeguard this sensitive information. And for good reason, because it's very common target for cyber attacks. Because this is what allows criminals to commit identity theft and enables fraudsters to, better imitate credit card holders. So we also have chargeback. A chargeback, just very high level, is when a customer reports a fraudulent or otherwise unsatisfactory transaction to their credit card issuer. So there are both fraudulent chargebacks and non-fraudulent chargebacks. Under both, the issuer is legally obligated to refund the charge. And just a couple of different items there, on the non-fraud side of things, like item not received, item defective. Typically, a fraud-related chargeback reason code would be unauthorized use. And then we have on the opposite side of a chargeback in the landscape of fraud are false declines. And a false decline is when a retailer mistakenly rejects an order from a legitimate customer due to suspected fraud. So false declines may occur for various reasons. Most of the time, it's a result of fraud filters such as ABS or data mismatches, or really simply that the retailer has insufficient data to confidently approve the transaction. So in handling chargebacks and false declines, merchants have a couple of options which we'll go into. But at a high level, rules-based is one, and in the context of CNP fraud management, rules-based systems are used by merchants to determine how to handle a transaction. Based on various criteria, it's typically a score of the risk profile of that order. And then there's machine learning. Machine learning's talked about a lot now. It's basically just an advanced artificial intelligence technique which allows computers to refine their behavior or learn without being explicitly programmed. So now that all of you, I think we've covered some of the important terms and we have that under our belt. Let's take a look at the 6 W's of e-commerce fraud.
Thanks, Steve. So getting into the background of e-commerce fraud, I always like this quote by Rudyard Kipling. He was the author of the Jungle Book, and this quote specifically is from The Elephant's Child. And it's, I kept 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. So we're going to go over the 6 W's, the what, why, when, how, where, and who of e-commerce fraud for you. So let's begin with the what. So what is e-commerce fraud? Well, broadly speaking, e-commerce fraud is the unauthorized use of any information that results in an online business transaction. And we did leave this definition intentionally broad because, as you will see in a moment, e-commerce fraud comes in many different forms. And it isn't technically accurate to simply say the unauthorized use of just payment information. So how about the why of e-commerce fraud, Dean?
Yeah, so the question that often comes up as merchants and retailers see an increase is, hey, why is this happening? Why is e-commerce fraud increasing? And to put it simply, fraudsters are following the money. E-commerce as a market has grown significantly over the last decade. Shoppers are obviously increasingly buying everything from groceries to luxury fashion online, and fraudsters are taking advantage. As you can see in the graphic, online commerce has grown to $450 billion in the U.S. alone. So now that we know why e-commerce fraud is increasing, just want to give a little background on when e-commerce fraud began.
So when did e-commerce fraud begin? Well, the first documented case of e-commerce fraud was in 1994. And it was actually around the same time that merchants first started selling products online. So fraudsters would steal credit card numbers and use famous names in the first and last name fields of online payment forms. Businesses, obviously overly excited to receive online orders to begin with, didn't even think about the possibility of someone trying to steal from them. So you can imagine how they must have felt when they were reviewing orders that were coming in and seeing names like Mickey Mouse, Bill Clinton, Clark Kent, and even the late John Lennon purchasing goods from their website. So the how of e-commerce fraud is a bit more complicated than the first 3 W's of e-commerce fraud. So we'll spend a few more slides going over that. Let's take a closer look.
So how does e-commerce fraud happen? Again, it's typically happens in 5 stages. Generally, there's a hack to start. The purpose of the hack is to steal that personally identifiable information, and that information is then sold on what's known as the dark web. And that's essentially the medium where the fraudsters purchase information that they ultimately use to commit fraud. Right, once the innocent victim sees this unauthorized charge on their credit card, they call their bank, they say, hey, that wasn't me. They file what's known as a chargeback. I think, unfortunately, at this point, most individuals have had some unauthorized use on their card. I know I have. And that's kind of the 5 stages in which it happens. So let's try to take a closer look at how fraudsters get that PII. And as I mentioned, it starts with the hack. So in order for fraudsters to commit the crime, they must first have the right data, and they get that data by either exploiting IT vulnerabilities of a business or the employees that work for or with the business. So an IT vulnerability hack is basically when the hacker exploits a weakness within the software or hardware used at a company to perform an unauthorized action within the computer system. A good example of this happened last year when hackers exploited a website application vulnerability over at Equifax. So this particular framework was pretty much prone to a remote code execution vulnerability, and what it did was it allowed the hackers to remotely run code on the website, which ultimately exposed the name, address, date of birth, driver's license, and social security number of more than 147 million customers. Obviously very well known. And then there's the human vulnerability hack or social engineering, and this is where a hacker will trick an employee of a target business into gaining access to the company's computer network. A good example of this occurred a couple years ago, 2014, when hackers used what's known as a phishing email to deceive a Home Depot vendor into providing their login credentials. And this kind of allowed them through the back door to get in and steal the payment card data and email addresses of 56 million consumers. So that's the first stage of it. So, what does a hacker do once they've collected all of this information? Well, they're out for financial gain. So they sell it, of course, but where?
Yeah, so they sell it on the dark web. And the dark web is really just content that exists on dark nets. And to access the dark net, you have to do this through a Tor or similar software intended to conceal a user's location from anyone conducting surveillance. Dark nets are commonly used to facilitate illegal activities, providing services such as exchanges to facilitate fraud. This is where hackers sell information they stole. It's important to remember that it's not just credit card details that scammers are buying on the dark web. Hacked dating profiles, streaming services, Airbnb accounts are for sale too. These accounts cumulatively form your entire online identity, as can be seen in this graphic here, and it can be sold for about $1,200, unfortunately. So some of the categories that you find on the dark web are personal finance, like credit cards and PayPal logins, proof of identity, passport scans, selfies, utility bills, online shopping accounts like Amazon, Best Buy, travel, Airbnb, entertainment, Netflix, Shopify, communication sites like Skype, delivery sites like USPS and DHL, social media, of course, even dating profiles like Tinder and Bumble. And just to give you the size of the scope of these sort of dark nets and dark webs, there are about 3 million Tor users globally, and 100 gigabytes worth of data is consumed per second through these networks.
Great, thanks, Emily. Yeah, so once the hack goes to the dark web, right, it gets into the hands of the fraudster. But the dark web is not just a place to buy and sell stolen information. It's actually also a community where fraudsters are made. So just as your organization provides training to its workforce, the dark web has their form of training as well, right? Because hackers need people that are able to commit these crimes, so they have someone to sell their ill-gotten data to. As a matter of fact, this ecosystem is so robust that there are actually, within the dark web, manuals and courses on topics such as e-commerce fraud best practices, which include things like the best time of day or year to commit e-commerce fraud. There are vendors on the dark web peddling technology designed to spoof or fake an IP address or cloak a device. And there's even information about which merchants are the easiest to steal from and methods and ways to go about that. Interestingly, it's not just end users buying this data within this ecosystem. There are third parties. And what they do is an effort to add value. They're essentially a middleman that will purchase the raw data from the hackers. Then they use bots to verify the data. They enrich it with external databases. Most of the time it's both. So basically they're cleaning up the data, and then they resell it on the dark web at a higher price or at a premium because it's better quality to the fraudster who will ultimately be using it to steal from your website. So it's just an incredibly robust ecosystem on there.
Yeah, it really is, Dean. And so then it comes down to the fraud, right? So the fraudster has everything they need at this point to commit e-commerce fraud. They have the PPI from the hack. They have the knowledge from the dark web and the tools that they've gathered from the community on the dark web. And so essentially what a fraudster will do is they'll visit your website and begin placing orders. And it may only start as one order. And as long as the card they're using is approved, you better believe that they're going to continue placing more orders. And they may even share their knowledge on the dark web saying, hey, this XYZ site is a great site to steal from because they're not doing any sort of verification, or if you use this sort of technique, you'll be able to get the transaction approved. The products that the fraudsters are buying are then shipped directly to the fraudster, a reshipper, or the true card holder. If the item is being shipped directly to the fraudster, it's because they either have knowledge that you aren't reviewing the order for billing and shipping mismatches, or they simply don't care. If the item is being sent to a reshipper, it's for the purpose of masking the final destination of the product. And if the item is being sent to the true card holder, the fraudster will either redirect the package once it's in transit or swipe it upon delivery. Regardless of the shipping method, the fraudster is still getting the goods and you're still paying the price. So what comes at the end is this vicious cycle. So the chargeback occurs when the rightful owner of the credit card notices an unauthorized transaction on their statement and disputes the charge. The issuing bank then initiates the chargeback, and it's deducted from your merchant account. In CMP transactions, as Dean mentioned, merchants are liable for the chargeback. Once a chargeback is initiated, the funds are withdrawn from your merchant account along with any fees, and we'll talk about those in a second, and sent to the cardholder's issuing bank. Unfortunately, this whole process can take weeks, even months, long after the good has been shipped. So your business is now out the product that you shipped, the revenue you received, and any additional fees associated with the chargeback. It is also important to note, however, that the total cost of e-commerce fraud is not just limited to the chargebacks. Unfortunately, as you'll see shortly, chargebacks result in additional costs that can be greater than the chargebacks themselves, including additional fraud management, increased false declines, and the damage to your customer's overall experience. So let's take a look at where fraud is most prevalent.
Great, thanks, Anthony. Yeah, so essentially, where is e-commerce fraud the most prevalent? Where are those chargebacks occurring most frequently? Yeah, anywhere that goods are sold online in significant volume. Everything that I've seen and we've seen in our analytics, e-commerce fraud is not limited by borders. Fraud is a very dynamic and ever-changing. You know, and fraudsters do this for a living, so they will adapt their methods based on what is available to them, because it's essentially the way that they put food on their table. So it really is not limited by borders. And then the question is, well, who is committing e-commerce fraud? I know we promised some interesting stories. When you look at who is committing e-commerce fraud, it really can be anyone. There's an extremely well-known computer company that I had the opportunity to speak with, and they were losing at one point to a single fraudster over $1 million per year. They tracked this fraudster down. He was actually located in New Jersey. They were working with law enforcement at the time to build a case against this particular person, when that eventually resulted in a knock on their door. What they found was that this was a 16-year-old high school student that was buying stolen credit cards on the dark web, ripping them off, taking their, their game console, and basically selling it, again on things like Craigslist. So when you look at who is committing e-commerce fraud, fraudsters can take many forms, whether that's a sophisticated group of organized criminals, or it could just be a 16-year-old kid, your next door neighbor. The difficult part is identifying the patterns that will most likely lead to a chargeback from a merchant perspective, and blocking that transaction from being approved.
Great, so we covered the background of e-commerce fraud. Now it's important to cover the types of e-commerce fraud. And so we, broadly speaking here at Riskified, we bucket them into 3 different buckets. There's checkout fraud, account takeovers, and friendly fraud. So let's take a deeper dive into all 3 types. We'll start with checkout fraud. So checkout fraud is the traditional explicit type of fraud that exists, and an individual steals credit card information with the intention of making a financial transaction without the explicit authorization of the cardholder. To give you a size of the scope of this sort of bucket of fraud, 1.49% of all e-commerce transactions in 2005 were fraudulent attempts, or roughly about $3.5 billion, according to a recent Experience study.
Right, and then there's what we're seeing as an increasingly common type of fraud in account takeovers. An account takeover is really when a fraudster, well, there are 2 main types, but generally it's when a fraudster steals the login information of a legitimate customer and then orders products through their account, either rerouting the items to a different address or stealing the items when they're delivered. Basically, we look at this, there are 2 main types of account takeover. There is the mismatch ATO, which is when a fraudster will log into a user's account and then use either a stolen credit card or actually the credit card on file to make a purchase. Merchants kind of look at this as, hey, that valid login credentials, that's good enough. And a lot of times they just tend to auto approve these types of orders, right? They know the customer. And they're also worried that any additional verification could cause friction, potentially preventing the customer's purchase, or even worse, pushing them to a competitor. And then there's loyalty fraud. So loyalty fraud is when a fraudster does this, right? They log into a user's account once again, but rather than using a credit card, what they'll do is they'll use the accrued points or credits in the account that they've taken over. So this is commonplace in the travel and hotel worlds. And again, just to give you a scope on this product, and this is a couple of years old now, and we've only seen this number go up. But that was 2.3 billion lost in 2016 alone.
Great. And so the last type of e-commerce fraud is friendly fraud. And friendly fraud, aka liar buyer, buyer's remorse, occurs when a customer makes a purchase with their own credit card and then requests a chargeback after receiving the goods. They do this because they either want the product without paying for it or because they're having buyer's remorse. Though this type of fraud is particularly difficult to identify before it happens, there are ways to get the chargeback reversed after it happens. For those of you interested in how to win a chargeback dispute, you should focus on collecting the right information during the transaction itself. And that type of information includes the proof of delivery, for example, signed proof of delivery of the cardholder's shipping address to the cardholder's shipping address rather. Customer communications such as emails or text messages, the verifications that you've had with the customer, even phone calls, address matches such as billing and shipping address, positive payment results, meaning the customer used a similar payment method for previous purchases, IP information, this is a little bit more technical, but IP information like were they using a proxy, or browsing data such as their behavior when they were on the site, did they actually view all of the information, all of the products on the product page, or did they just simply make a purchase without really thinking about it? The purchase history, details like the legitimate purchasing behavior of the customer, and then social media, of course. And a funny little anecdote about social media, here at Riskified, we actually dispute chargebacks on behalf of clients. And so we were working with a client, and an individual filed a chargeback for tickets to a major sporting event, claiming that the transaction was unauthorized. We subsequently found pictures on Facebook of the customer at the stadium attending the event. And this isn't only isolated to just that one incident. We actually have another example where a customer filed a chargeback for a pair of luxury shoes and then posted on Instagram the shoes that they claimed they never ordered and they wanted a chargeback for. So in both cases, we successfully disputed the claims on behalf of the client using social media as supplementary evidence. So these are the three types of fraud, right? We've got checkout, account takeover, and friendly fraud. But let's take a look at how these result in, like what type of losses these results in for businesses and by just how much.
Great. Yeah, so like what is the true cost of e-commerce fraud? Because as we mentioned, it's not just chargebacks. It's a lot more than just the direct cost of chargebacks and that lost revenue, which oftentimes in and of itself are high enough for businesses to take steps to prevent it. But we can break down the cost of e-commerce fraud into three buckets. The first of that is fraud management, or the costs associated with fraud prevention, people, tools, technology. Then there are chargebacks, or the costs incurred when a consumer initiates a chargeback against your business. And then probably one of the more costly buckets is false declines. So the value of the false declines themselves, or the otherwise lost revenue from declining that. And then the lost lifetime value of the customer, as well as the wasted acquisition costs or the marketing dollars that you spent to bring them to your site. And I think, Anthony, could you share some of the costs associated with fraud management?
Yeah, so on average, fraud is costing merchants 8% of annual revenues, according to Javelin's 2017 financial impact study of fraud. And while this 8% includes the cost of fraud management, chargebacks, and false declines, the majority of this expenditure comes in the form of fraud management itself, which makes up 75% of fraud costs, an amount that is triple the actual fraud losses themselves and 10 times the amount merchants lose to chargebacks. So as you can see, merchants spend a lot more managing fraud than they do on the chargebacks themselves.
I just kind of touched on chargebacks a bit before, but just to give you a little bit more of information, you guys may be familiar with it now, but they can also come with an additional cost in the form of fees. We have a couple numbers up there. So typically, if it's less than, your chargeback rate is less than 1% of the total sales, that's generally acceptable. Anytime you go over 1%, you do run the risk of incurring chargeback fees from some of the issuers. So this can get like pretty costly in the extremely risky merchants who incur more than 100 chargebacks while also maintaining a chargeback to transaction ratio of at least 1% for 2 consecutive months. They may even be placed into an excessive chargeback program, which can result in fees of up to $100 per incident. So with the cost of chargebacks alone, it can be the goods that you're out, the revenue that you have to return, and now you get a $100 fine essentially on top of that. For merchants that remain above 1% and stay in the excessive chargeback program, not only will they have to pay the $100 per incident, but there's also the possibility of a $25,000 monthly review fee, or in the most extreme case, the actual termination of your merchant processing agreement.
Yeah, chargebacks are definitely difficult to deal with, and Dean definitely shed some light on sort of the range you want to be in as a merchant. But even the 1% I think is still high for a lot of the merchants we work with, right, Dean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think it's important to cover false declines, and when we look at Riskified and we look at sort of our customer base, we don't really look at how we manage fraud in the sense that, you know, we're here to stop fraud. We actually manage it from a different perspective in the sense that we approve transactions. So the last and the largest cost of fraud to merchants is the impact on false declines, which can be broken down into 3 buckets: the value of false declines, the lost lifetime value of the customer, and the wasted acquisition costs. So if we look at the value of false declines, as fraud increases, businesses tend to become overly cautious, scrutinizing high value orders and or incorrectly declining orders. This not only causes additional friction within the customer checkout experience as customers are waiting for their orders to be reviewed, but it also causes lost revenue from declined orders that should have been approved. In fact, in $109 billion of revenue was lost to orders being falsely declined due to fear of fraud. It was last year that was 109 was lost. And these false declined orders tend to be 1.6 times the value of regular orders themselves. And so if merchants were to eliminate false declines in the US alone, they would generate revenue equivalent to about 3 Black Fridays per year. So as we look at the lost lifetime value of customers, so obviously what happens to your customer when they experience a long review time or worse, a false decline? Well, our data shows that 26% of declined cardholders reduce their patronage to a merchant following a decline, or worse, 32% stop shopping with the merchant entirely. And then of course, there's the last bucket, which is the customer lifetime value. And we look at the wasted acquisition cost of a customer, right? So if you look at a customer and if you look at a merchant, they spend a significant amount of money and resources marketing to ensure customers find their store and buy their merchandise, but those businesses are actually losing a significant percentage of their advertising revenue to false declines. So if we take, for example, a merchant that spends $500,000 a year to bring in 1,000 orders at an average of $500 per order, of those 1,000 orders, we can assume 50 of them are declined for fear of fraud, or 5% false decline rate, or a 5% decline rate rather. But 70% of those declined orders are in fact false positives, which means at least 30 of those orders being rejected were actually legitimate. So if you take the 30 orders that were rejected and you multiply it by the $500 per order, you're at $15,000 of your advertising budget was wasted, and that's not including the potential you lost from declining those orders. So you can see that the impact of false declines to merchants is really great. So what options do merchants have to protect themselves against this?
Yeah, that's great, Anthony. Yeah, that's actually with false declines. It's also, some folks look at it as a customer offense rate, because you're offending customers when you falsely decline them. So it's, I think what we've seen in fraud management is very difficult to manage the balance between chargeback rates and false declines. So there are a couple of options when you look at fraud prevention. And it's really just two options when you're trying to protect your business from e-commerce fraud while balancing high approval rates or minimizing false declines. And you can either build an in-house team to manually review orders, or hire an external partner, such as Riskified to handle that prevention for you. But let's take a look first at the in-house option.
Great, yeah, so an in-house team, these teams usually work in combination with rules-based systems and manual reviews. Basically, as orders come in, they're passed through their system, they check to see if the order clears a certain criteria, such as billing, shipping mismatches, CVV errors, etc. Orders that pass the system are either approved, declined, or sent to manual review. Orders that are sent to manual review are approved or declined by a fraud analyst. And just to quickly touch on what Dean mentioned before, rules-based are each order is approved or declined based on predetermined set of rules. While this approach has the benefit of making quick decisions, the system requires a lot of maintenance as rules need to be created and updated based on the knowledge of previous chargebacks. And then manual review, each order is reviewed by a fraud analyst before it is approved or declined. And while this approach has the benefit of being highly accurate, since humans can review all of the variables holistically, such as billing, shipping, social profiles, it's resource intensive in the form of employees, like training and hiring, time, reviewing each order, especially during peak hours or off hours, and the additional sources of data to ensure the analyst can make the right decisions, such as address verification or email age. So if you're considering setting up and managing an internal fraud review team, there are three things that you should keep in mind. First, be aware during peak shopping periods, such as holidays, more team members must be hired and trained. Moreover, after hours, those which occurred after normal business hours are either handled more slowly by a skeleton crew or queued for review during the next business day. Not managing this well can result in an experience that's less than optimal for your customers. The second is most fraud prevention teams are incentivized to prevent fraud. And unfortunately, they become overly cautious once chargebacks actually start to surface. The results are in-house fraud prevention teams that falsely decline a lot of good orders. And as we've seen, that's actually the biggest cause of revenue loss to merchants is false declines. So it's really important that you incentivize your fraud prevention team not to prevent fraud, but to approve as many orders as possible. And also you start monitoring how they use, because when you create rules, it's based on the chargebacks that you had previously. And so you want to make sure that bias of preventing fraud doesn't creep into the rules or the decisions that they're making to create those rules in your rules-based system. And so, for example, if you get a chargeback from a certain address, the natural reaction is, okay, we're never going to let that person from that address order from our website again. Well, actually, that address could be associated with a dorm room or a corporate office building where hundreds, if not thousands, of great customers live, but you've unfortunately blocked it because of the fact that one person caused a chargeback. And we've seen this before with a lot of merchants. And the third is to be mindful of international orders. Reviewing international orders requires a different mindset than domestic orders. Often international shoppers will use reshippers to reduce shipping costs. So it's important to use localized data to enrich your orders. For example, localized address verification systems in that region or social media in that region to make sure that you're not blocking good international orders. So if you decide that in-house is not for you, let's take a look at how that compares with an outsourced solution.
Great, thanks, Anthony. Yeah, within outsourced fraud prevention, there are a number of solutions available. Kind of like an in-house, there are those that leverage rules and manual review. And then there are also those that use machine learning and offer a chargeback guarantee. All these solutions differ both in price and performance, but there are a few things to keep in mind if and when you're going to set up and manage an outsourced fraud prevention solution. One of those things is, hey, do we want, number one, or do they offer a chargeback guarantee? Typically, the solutions that do offer a chargeback guarantee will just simply provide decisions. If they say to approve an order and that order results in a chargeback, the guarantee says that, hey, they'll reimburse the full amount, so they have some skin in the game. And then you want to know that if you're going to outsource, hey, can you do this better than we can? Do you have a performance guarantee? I always look at fraud prevention as something that just on the surface level is easy. It's very easy to decline a bunch of risky looking orders and have zero chargebacks. What's difficult is finding high risk orders that can be approved accurately, right? And then does the solution provider you're considering guarantee that their solution will increase your approval rate? And then, right, at the end of the day, it's about attracting and retaining customers. And you want to know how that solution will impact customer friction. Because another way to reduce chargebacks is simply to increase verification methods, whether that's text messages, phone calls. I've seen, people put micro transactions on someone's credit card and they have to verify the amount. The problem with that is that it can dramatically reduce not just the threat of chargebacks, but also reduce the conversion rate, which in the end will hurt revenue more than it will help costs. Great, and then Anthony and I are both from Riskified, so I just want to kind of quickly go over and introduce you to who we are and more on what we do. We are a chargeback guarantee fraud prevention solution. So with us, there are no additional costs. There's no maintenance, no training, no updates. Right, we're very flexible in the machine learning that we use. It learns from each transaction. When we work with businesses, we typically try to find segments or order populations that are more problematic and start there. For example, some merchants will only send us orders they plan to decline because, hey, it's like that's otherwise lost revenue. Send it to Riskified, see what they can approve. If it comes back as a chargeback, we're not liable for it. So the risk, while is very low. And again, there's the speed. With that, right, removing customer friction, having instant decisions, and when you outsource something like this, you want transparency. You want to know, hey, how are you performing? Why are you making the decisions that you're making? And we work hard to make sure that our customers have, transparency into our performance in real time. And we have, as a company, about 130 people in R&D. I think this is just very important. It's in over in Tel Aviv because. Right, we were a built product first, and I think that's why, or a key differentiator for us. Most of the company is in research and development, data analytics, things like that, and that's a major reason why we have 1,000+ clients, including publicly traded companies. We've listed some of them here. I think the key takeaway from this is that fraud goes after any industry, as you can see. I mean, gift cards is probably one that you could have guessed, sneakers with Finish Line, and then we even have some here like Global Industrial would sell B2B online and have seen fraud. So fraudsters do not discriminate. They find where the money is and they go after it.
So let's look at a quick recap of what we've gone over today. The key takeaways. With e-commerce sales only accounting for approximately 10% of total retail sales in the US, it's almost guaranteed that e-commerce fraud will continue to grow online as shopping becomes the preferred sales channel. Don't rely solely on rules-based systems. They have a tendency to increase false declines. They don't adapt to new buying behaviors, and they're easy for fraudsters to overcome. And data is your friend. The more of it you have to analyze, the better decisions you can make. So we will now open it up for Q&A.
Okay, Anthony, there's a few questions that our audience submitted. The first question, can you provide some specific ways for businesses to protect themselves against account takeovers?
Okay, sure, yeah. So a lot of this goes outside of the scope of this particular webinar, and we definitely do have more information on our website for those of you who are interested in this growing trend of account takeovers. But account takeovers are a bit more difficult to stop than e-commerce fraud, because instead of verifying the identity at checkout, you're doing it at login. So similar to e-commerce fraud prevention, this must be done in real time. So it definitely makes sense to have an automated process in place rather than a human reviewing it. And some of the things you want to look for are the IP location and whether that matches up with the IP location at the account creation. the number of password attempts, the keystroke velocity to detect whether it was a bot that was trying to, like Dean mentioned, verify information or log into an account through a brute force attack. And of course, just like fraud prevention, you're trying to paint a picture. You don't use one piece of data to make a decision. You basically will take all of this data together. For example, an unknown IP location with 10 password attempts, all entered within a matter of seconds. But even then, what's the right course of action? Do you lock the person out of their account? Do you ask them to go through some verification methods? Even those verification methods, how rigorous are they? It really depends on the type of data that you're housing on the other end. So, I hope that answered your question, at least superficially. But if you have more questions about ATO, I definitely recommend going to our website, riskified.com. We have tons of content in the blog and the resources section about account takeovers.
All right, there's another question that has been asked. What does your chargeback guarantee mean exactly?
Dean?
Sure, yeah. So the chargeback guarantee that we offer means that for every order that comes through our system, which we provided an approved decision, or right, we've told you, hey, this is not fraud, go ahead and approve it. If a chargeback does occur on that order and it comes back as a fraudulent, reason code, we will provide you with all of the money back, including any of the associated fees or chargeback fees. We do that within 48 hours of the chargeback being reported to us. So what does it mean exactly? It means that if we tell you to approve an order and it comes back as a fraudulent chargeback, we'll reimburse you within 48 hours.
Okay, we have another question here. If you're liable for all the fees associated with a chargeback, aren't you just going to decline risky orders?
Oh, that's yeah, sure, I'll jump in. That's a great question. The short answer is no. We mentioned the performance guarantee earlier, and as part of our engagements, and can we contractually agree typically to higher approval rates? So we're held to that. The longer answer is that our pricing model aligns us with the companies that we partner with. That's because we only get a percentage per approved order. So we take like a small percentage per approved order, which essentially means that we only make money when our clients make money. So this model, it incentivizes us to approve as many good orders as possible while managing risk in a responsible way. I hope that's answered your question.
Okay, Anthony and Dean, there are no more questions at this time. If anyone does have any questions, I will provide your email addresses when I send the PDF version of the presentation, and our members can follow up directly with you. With that said, we are going to close today's webinar. I would like to thank Anthony and Dean for taking time to present to our group today, and thank all of today's attendees for taking time out of their day to join us. Thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.